What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the heaviest show in the entire universe, where we talk about all things heavy and brutal. And today, we're going to talk about something that, in my opinion, has been completely overlooked by everyone in the metal community for almost 30 years. And that is, what exactly is the first death metal album? Let's get into it. Okay, so when we talk about death metal and what the first death metal album actually is, there are often two albums that people like to put side by side. The first one being Possessed Seven Churches from 1985. And the second being Scream Bloody Gore by Chuck Schuldiner and the almighty Death. And now both of these albums are fantastic in their own right, but when we sit down and we listen to Seven Churches by Possessed, well then, that's a thrash metal album. That is truly a thrash metal album. It's got death metal elements, and of course, it's got the song Death Metal on it. And of course, Possessed also released a demo back in 1983 or 84 called Death Metal, but was their sound really reminiscent of what would later be known to become death metal? What about Scream Bloody Gore? Well, that is definitely a death metal album, but it didn't come out until 1987. Now, was there an album between the two, between Seven Churches and Scream Bloody Gore, that we could say really laid the groundwork and was actually the first death metal album of all time? I think there is. Of course, this is something that I've never seen anyone else talk about. I've never seen anyone else really put out into the ether and see what everyone else thinks about it. And I think that's a huge mistake. Now, the thing is Slayer is a thrash metal band. They'll always be a thrash metal band, and they always played thrash metal. Everyone has said that Rain and Blood definitely laid the groundwork for what death metal would become. And almost every death metal band that came out after 1986 has said that they were inspired by Rain and Blood. Well then, why isn't Rain and Blood ever even talked about when it comes to the first death metal albums? Now, I think the reason for this is because, like I said before, Slayer is a thrash band. They played thrash metal before Rain and Blood. They played thrash metal after Rain and Blood. And their production quality was really good compared to a lot of thrash bands, and compared to a lot of the early death metal bands, their production was just on another level. But just like how everyone says that Motorhead was one of the first thrash metal bands, well, they weren't a thrash band, they were a new wave of British heavy metal band. They were a heavy metal band that played thrash metal at times. They started the sound, they invented the sound, they took metal to another level. They took heavy metal to another level, a faster, harder, heavier level. Just like Venom did the exact same thing. They took metal and they made it faster, they made it heavier, they made it more violent and intense and satanic. And they're often credited with starting thrash metal as well, and starting black metal, and even a little tiny bit of death metal. But what about Slayer? What about Rain and Blood? This same thing can be said for them, that they took what is thrash metal and they took it to its pinnacle, to its heavy, fastest, most intense, satanic and evil and brutal pinnacle, and created death metal. So let's get a bit deeper into this, and I want to start off with the song Necrophobic. See, songs like Necrophobic, those fast tremolo picking riffs, were the basis for death metal. You see every death metal band following a blueprint like this on at least a few songs on every album coming out after this. When I listen to this song, I don't hear thrash metal. And I'm surprised that other people could hear thrash metal, and the only reason I think people could hear thrash metal out of this song is because that's what Slayer is. That's what Slayer's always been. It's always been thrash metal, and they've always been labeled as thrash metal, and there's no death growls. But were there even death growls on Possessed Seven Churches? Well, no, those aren't death growls at all. It's just poor production and a bit dirty or grungier vocals. And I would say something like Scream Bloody Gore is way closer to what a death growl would be than anything Possessed did before 1986. And if we move along and we look at a song like Piece by Piece, that's a death metal riff through and through. The power chord slides with fretboard crawls in between each slide, that would later become a staple in a lot of death metal music, as soon as 1989. Compared to other thrash metal bands at this time, Slayer was darker, was more twisted, was faster, was heavier, was way more violent and brutal than all of them. That includes Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth, Exodus, Testament, Creator, Sodom, like all those German bands as well. Like it's not comparable who was the fastest and the heaviest. It was Slayer, hands down, to the point where for this album and this album alone, they became a death metal band without knowing it, because there was no death metal. Well, at least there was no death metal as we know it today and as we knew it after those albums were released, because this was it. This album created death metal. It is death metal. If we look at the A scale riffing in Altars of Sacrifice, that riffing on a scale like that would later become a staple in all death metal later on, even in the late 90s and early 2000s, with bands like Opeth and bands like Death once they became more technical. An album like Seven Churches is way more of a thrash album than something like Rain and Blood ever will be or ever could be. Now, if we go and have a look at the definition of death metal over at our friend Wikipedia, it says, and I quote, deep growling vocals, aggressive, powerful drumming, featuring double kick and blast beat techniques, minor keys or atonality, abrupt tempo, key and time signature changes, and chromatic chord progressions. Now, aside from two of these things, blast beats and deep guttural growling vocals, this encapsulates what Rain in Blood is. They layer their time signatures. Of course, everything's in minor. Metal is always played in minor. Double kick is featured prominently on this album, of course, as well. It was really coming into prominence in thrash metal in around 1986, because before that it wasn't as prominent, but with an album like this, double kick later on became a hard basis for what thrash metal and of course death metal would become. Powerful drumming on display in this album also laid the groundwork for how death metal drummers would play in the future, like the that started here. That didn't start anywhere else. That didn't start on Seven Churches. That didn't start on Scream Bloody Gore. That started with Dave Lombardo in Slayer on Rain and Blood. Waiting to unfold, raging out control, adapt the potency, death machine investment. And even the guitar solos. If you look at what King and Hanneman were doing on Rain and Blood, you can see the influence that they had on someone like Trey from Morbid Angel, especially on the album Altars of Madness. It's like as if King and Hanneman are playing the solos on that album themselves. listen to songs like Postmortem and Piece by Piece and Reborn and Epidemic, and these are all songs that encapsulate what death metal is and what death metal would eventually become once other bands like Death really took it to the next level. Without this album, there is no death metal. Let's have a look at some song comparisons.
Taking away your sacred life, in many ways I shall describe. Do you wanna die? The waves of glitter rushing near, pounding at the walls of life, turning out my sanity, reaching back.
The deeper we dive into this album, the more we see how overlooked this was as a death metal album, not a thrash metal album. And still one of the greatest albums of all time, but probably the album where death metal truly started. Ask any death metal musician and he'll say Rain and Blood is the inspiration that brought me to the fold. Of course there's Metallica, and of course there's Megadeth and Creator and Sodom that inspired these guys. Of course they're going to say that those were inspirations, but if you have them list one album, it's not going to be Master of Puppets that inspired them to create death metal. It's going to be Rain and Blood, because Rain and Blood was the first death metal album of all time.